Begin 2026 with our first speaker, Jigna Desai. Today we have Jigna Desai with us, who will be speaking on how to read historic cities through debates on thinking or imagining about the future of these cities. So before she begins, I'll introduce her briefly. Jigna is a professor at the Faculty of Architecture, CEPT University, Ahmedabad. She is an architect who works with the questions of transformation, preservation, and conservation of historic built environments and heritage places. She has, for over a decade, worked towards consolidating conservation education at the faculty. Jigna has also been a part of heritage monitoring missions, evaluations, and advice for the International Council for Monuments and Sites, World Heritage Committee, and World Monuments. She is currently a visiting professor at Nottingham Trent University, UK. She has been the Getty Guest Scholar for the year 24-25 for her distinctive work on unintentional monuments addressing challenges of conserving modern heritage of South Asia. Jigna has written extensively on architecture, heritage conservation, and world heritage issues in India, and her most notable book is Equity in Heritage Conservation, The Case of Ahmedabad, which was published by Routledge in 2019. So Jigna, you have 40 to 45 minutes to present, and which will be followed by Q&A from the participants. And we request participants to type their questions in chat box. We will ask these questions once Jigna is finished, and you can also ask questions directly to Jigna. So over to you, Jigna.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm trying to share my screen here. Can you see my screen? Thank you very much, Rama, for the introduction. And also let me start by thanking Champaka, who nudged me to present my thoughts in this forum. It is indeed a privilege to be sharing my thoughts on a platform provided by Center for Policy Research and the Center de Sciences Humaines. I'll be sharing an introspective of my work and my observations on how historic cities transform in our context and what does that do to us as inhabitants of those cities. And I do not mean just physical inhabitants, but as people who inhabit these cities through their meanings and through their knowledge. Before we get there, I want to spend a little time understanding the reasons why we as humanity and societies at some point in our histories decided that historic cities are worth conserving. The first examples are from the USA, UK, and parts of Europe, each a result of a discourse on environment, knowledge, and inclusivity, all in response to the rapid changes due to the Industrial Revolution induced renewal projects and, of course, the First World War. USA, for example, started identifying historic districts as a way of ensuring that migrant histories are preserved through conserving old neighborhoods that were under threat of road widening and redevelopment. The earliest example go to early 1930s. Before that, in early 1900s, Patrick Geddes in Scotland and in India, and Gustavo Giovanni in Italy suggested a sensitive restructuring or surgery, as Geddes called it. I'm trying to figure out how this is happening. This is an image of Patrick Geddes' conservative surgery as he practiced in different parts of in different cities of India. I think there were around 30 cities that he made plans for. And of course, in Scotland, he worked on Edinburgh. His first plan for Edinburgh are considered to be quite legendary in the sense that there are still many lessons to be taken from there. This is an example of Italy, of Tangier, where you will see that the standard plan of road widening would look like something like this. What he suggested was identifying areas that are dilapidated while preserving what's good and valuable. Giovanni suggested something similar in Italy after the wars of the First World War. The logic was biological, environmental, social, and of course, a response to the bombing of historic cities. That, that lived cities are negotiated through social and economic relationships, and that they hold meanings for people was at the core of their rationale. We must keep in mind that they were also responding to the very vehement healthy city narrative that was also pushed by the modernists. Early 1900s was a crucial time in the trajectory of urban histories and historic cities, as there were new agreements which were meant to be global from the colonial worldview, and the charters were being written about the futures of historic cities. On here, you see two charters: one, an Athens charter for restoration of historic monuments, which was in 1931, and there is an attitude to historic city that uh, you will see over here. Uh, Whereas on the right side here is the Athens, once again, an Athens charter written in 1935 or published in 1933, sorry, written in 31, but published in 33, which was written by uh, the CEAM, the Organization of Modernists, and Le Corbusier, Alison and Peter Smithson were all part of it. And here you'll see that the question of urbanism was looking at redesigning historic cities for a better access to light, health, and equality. The two Athens charters, as I said, one calling for conservation, another calling for renewal, continue to pop up as benchmarks for urban conservation, depending on which side of the development versus conservation line we are on. Conservation of historic cities as markers of cultural heritage and cultural landscape is a post-World War II narrative and a post-colonial discussion. It was thereon that the discourse hovered around identity and representation, little less about meaning. Nazi Germany clearly articulated that the end of civilization can only be complete when culture is taken away from the people. An idea and its aftermath is explored a lot in popular culture as well. My favorite being Monuments Men. Articulation of cities as physical fabric embodying cultural heritage has been central to global discourse. So is the idea that if one understands the other culture, we are less likely to harm it. Historic cities and their cultural heritage, when notified as World Heritage, have this additional burden of being knowledge projects that need to behave like living archaeology. In India, we started considering the question of historic cities as cultural heritage in early 1900s. Bringing Mumbai's urban heritage as a part of the urban development discussion began around that time, and Shyam Chainani articulates that journey in quite a bit of detail in his book Heritage and Environment, published in 2006 or 7, I think. Efforts from Hyderabad, Kolkata, Delhi, Mysore eventually all contributed to preparing a model codes for conserving urban heritage during those decades. The concerns were around built heritage that represented a time period and a layered history that revolved around the idea of national representation. Over the years, nationally as well as internationally, these ideas on what heritage can do to the peoples of the place has evolved into a question of placemaking, place belonging, ontological security, climate resource, livelihoods, sometimes recalling the early conversation of Geddes and Giuliani. This is a good segue for me to get into my primary case study, Historic City of Ahmedabad, that was notified as a World Heritage Site in 2017. There can be entire lecture about this journey of recognizing the domestic architecture and urban fabric as heritage, which started in late 1980s with Professor K.B. Jain and Professor Vasavada's work, but I will not get into that. I will jump to the time between 2011 and 2017, when the city was already as a part of the tentative list for being World Heritage. And there were a number of projects that started as a way to move towards the World Heritage City. This towards the World Heritage City was a Times of India tagline for, I think, at least half a decade. I'll be speaking of three projects from Ahmedabad, the ones that you see here on the slide, and then I will briefly talk about the Hriday scheme that was introduced in 2015. a year earlier. The three projects that I'm going to of Ahmedabad that going to talk about. The first one is the Bhadra Plaza project, which was under the JNNURM funding, and there were best of the architects and best of the intentions of archaeology and municipal corporation involved in that. Uh, the project was called Bhadra Plaza Revitalization Project. The second project that you see here in the center is a heritage street project that looks, and this is one of the Havelis that got restored as a part of that heritage street of Sakri Sheri, where the people who lived and owned some of these places were involved. And the third project is a part of the heritage walk, a chalk that was restored and given a new life as a part of the process of revitalizing the city. The This is an image of the Bhadra site, the Bhadra Plaza or the Bhadra Maidan as it used to be before uh, it became the plaza. This is a photograph from not from 1940s, from 1960s. There's an error there. From 1960s, where you see that like many Maidans of all historic cities that we know, it was a site where everything happened. The reason why 1960s is important for Gujarat and Gujarat was established in 1960s. Till then, Gujarat was part of Bombay Presidency, and uh, Ahmedabad and the Bhadra Maidan was the center of many political movements. The project that was proposed was in after the city got into the list of the tentative list of the World Heritage Site, and the project was uh, kind of awarded to create a place that is worthy of a World Heritage City. This site has a long history. Of course, as being the point where the city was kind of city started. The history dates back to early 1400s, where small wars happened outside the gate. Uh, this To the time of independence movement, where you here see that there are these processions that get carried on and there are these kind of uh, movements that took place here. The bungalow over here that you see over here is a Parsi bungalow that got constructed later on. So it's a place that has extremely layered history, some violent, some very good, some very glorious. There are also descriptions about this place in various chronicles. This was the proposal. This was not something that I've taken from the architect's website, but I've taken this from the government website. The first image of the Bhadra Plaza that was kind of publicized at the time of when the project was proposed. As you can see, the buildings that were in the center of this Maidan are removed. There are gardens proposed. You can see palm trees. You can see, well, people uh, apparently local people uh, performing culture here, and you will see people consuming that culture. I think the photograph itself, if there was somebody, an anthropologist, will probably do an entire lecture on what this photograph means. However, what the discussion or the background of this photograph or of this particular project was that there was a description of this particular Maidan uh, by a traveler, Mendelssohn, who traveled here in early 17th century. And he spoke about this project or he spoke about this Maidan as of being a particular size, of having fountains in the middle, of having citrus trees, of having palm trees, uh, and of being a place that is extremely worthy of a city as beautiful as Ahmedabad. And it was that particular description that kept on being recalled as the glorious history or as a glorious past that we uh, want to bring back as a part of the World Heritage narrative. Uh, Very interestingly, just 1.5 years later, there's a description by a German traveler, Thevenot, who speaks about the same Medan and speaks about this Medan as um, being extremely dusty, being impossible to walk in, extremely hot. And anybody who's been to Ahmedabad and anybody who understands uh, Ahmedabad's climate, uh, and somebody who's had lived here for long enough, my observation was that if you look at the dates, one person visited in winter, loved the Maidan, uh, observed everything, observed the greenery, observed the birds chirping. The other person possibly visited in summer. And in summer, the city is dusty. It has sand dune dusts going around, and what we call lu here, which is hot winds that go around. And it's impossible to stand in a place that is like this, uh, which kind of beg the question of what are we talking? Do we understand the nuances of the original glory when we quote it and when we talk about it and when we speak to restore a place to that particular glory? This project was, as I said, under the JNNURM funding, started in 2011 and was completed in 2014. In the December of 2014, in the November of 2014, there was a fantastic event here that included a Sufi event that got a lot of people here and that spoke about the historic city of Ahmedabad and the glory of it. There were comparisons of this particular plaza being approximately the same size as the plaza in Venice. There were certain relationships of the worthiness of the city as a World Heritage Site was being made. In the This photograph that you see over here is a month after. It's of the same place, looking towards the same darwaza, just a slightly different angle because that is the only height we could get when we were photographing it. This is end of November when we clicked this photograph in 2015, and you can see that the site is back to what it was. This is exactly how it was before, with except for there was a building in the middle, and now that building is gone, but the site is back to being a maidan which is dynamic and at various times of the day, various things happen. And this, what the question that I asked was that in this process of restoring the glory and imagined glory of a particular time, what were the narratives that were included and what were the narratives that got left out uh, and were important to the people? Of course, there is a lot that I discovered, but there were three narratives that were extremely interesting, and when I found them to be lost in the narrative of the Maidan, some of this loss is irreversible. Not this one. This that's in the background of this undergarment uh, Lari. What you see is Himaba Institute. There is also a little plaque here. Imaba Institute was built after 1850. There was this movement in Ahmedabad, which was known as the Sudharavadi movement, as we call it, or the progressive movement, where the Gujarati merchants worked with uh, people like Alexander Forbes uh, and others. And they promoted Gujarati literature. Gujarati Vernacular Society was found at that time. There was the first Gujarati um, history of Ahmedabad was written at that time by Magadlal Wakachan, who won kind of a competition of writing history. The first girls' school started at that time. The discussion around uh, widow remarriage started at that time. The first discussion around caste system and untouchability started around that time. And this Himaba Institute played a very important role, which it was a library and also the site for the first girls' school, played a very important role in what the city looked like at that point of time. Uh, because this was much later than the glorious past that we are seeking to preserve as a part of the outstanding universal value, this is something that we do not talk about in the narrative of the historic city of Ahmedabad. Uh, Once again, coming back to the structure that you saw or the side of one of the earlier photographs, this structure, as I said, was called Karanjawala Bungalow. Karanjawala Bungalow was a Parsi a bungalow that was built in late 1800s uh, as a site given by the British to a few Parsis that arrived in Ahmedabad in order to support the British administration. Uh, Parsi histories of Ahmedabad are also extremely interesting, extremely layered, and that the entire narrative of the historic city of Ahmedabad and the narrative of the Bhadra Plaza project does not recognize this as Karanjawala no Bungalow. Instead, recognizes this as the UCO Bank building, which was the function of the building. Was quite saddening to see that an entire layer of history did not get recognized. And because that did not get recognized, this bungalow was demolished as a part of creating the plaza and as a part of creating a new narrative or as a part of restoring the original glory. The third story is of this particular building, which sits on the edge of the plaza. Um, if you can see here, if your screen is big enough, it is called the League House. And this shop over here is Kaleem Book House, a bookshop. Uh, there's this old Shahid Bhai passed away a few years ago, but there was this person, Shahid Bhai Kaleemi, who was kind of a he recorded everything that happened in Ahmedabad since the time he could understand how to read and write. And uh, he remembers that he was a young boy when the partition of India was happening, and Jinnah had come to Ahmedabad, and he to urge to the Muslims of Ahmedabad and to suggest that the people should uh, vote for or move for joining Pakistan. There were two Muslim brothers in Ahmedabad, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, who fought against that, who stood up for wanting to be a part of the India that welcomed uh, everybody and all religions. And I found newspaper clips to verify this, that in early 1948, there were riots in order to oppose the suggestion that Ahmedabad should not be a part of India. This story, other than the oral history that is there, and other than this fact that you see that this is called um, the League House, is lost in the narrative of making of the plaza. Uh, I'll move on to the next two stories and very quickly talk about them as well. Uh, the two case studies, as I was talking about, one is of the Ganga Dhyani pole and that as a model heritage street. I believe this project is on at the moment, and the Kavi Dalpatram Chowk. Once again, Kavi Dalpatram was part of the progressive movement who wrote poems about uh, the society needing to become progressive. We are talking about late 1800s here. We're talking about before Gandhiji started talking about a certain idea of progressiveness. This and this both one of this is part of the heritage walk. This Kavi Dalpatram Chowk is part of the heritage walk. While both these projects are extremely kind of important to the city and are considered to be a successful direction towards making a World Heritage City, there were certain, once again, positions that I found that were um, un, unaddressed or attention not being paid to. So very quickly, this is the structure of the historic city of Ahmedabad. The Badra Plaza is somewhere here. Each of this is the walled city, and each of this is a pole. And each of the pole would have this kind of a structure that will have the main street, and this is the street where the Gangadhiani pole is. This is where the house is being renovated. This is a model heritage street that is being constructed or being made just now. There is a khadki. Every main street or a sheri will have a khadki, or will open to a pole, or a pole will open to khadki. So there are these layers of public chalks or private chalks that exist. This is how we have understood the city always, the historic city, as architecture students, as students of of history or historic uh, understanding historic cities or urbanism. Uh, when I was doing my PhD, I, however, found that there are other layers to how people moved in the city. The blue is what you find is the narrative that always gets recognized as there is a main street, and then there are secondary streets or sheris, and then there are pores and khadkis. I, however, found that, and we very romantically speak about how every pore has a little gate that opens into another gate, another pore, or through a house you could get into another pore, or that there are these back alleys that are chainis, and usually we speak about these chainis as places as being of existence because they enable um, wind movement. But when I got into the detail of how people move in the city, uh, once again, if you have a larger screen, you'll see a green line that goes through the back alleys and the back doors and the back houses. Uh, and you'll also see the brown lines here that move directly into the main streets or leak into the main streets. Uh, like in many cities, the occupation of the city or the movement of a city is a movement in a city is layered and gendered. Uh, Generally, in the main streets, you will not find women hanging around. You'll find women hanging around inside the poles. And one wonders that there is a lot of work around this idea of how women move in historic cities. And there's some books around move in cities, and that women will find safer places and safer areas to move around. Uh, and they may not be the same as how we understand the standard structure of the city. Here I found that some of these back alleys were the alleys through which women moved. And I found that this entire area is called Mandwini Pole. And if I were a woman, and if I start, I mean, I am a woman, but if I were a woman living in this city, and if I had to move from one derasar to another, or from one port to another, I practically do not have to get into the main street at all. I can navigate the entire city through the back alleys of and the houses, through people, through interactions with people. I also found literature and uh, uh, records that it is through these backdoor movements that the city negotiated peace after it erupted in violence. And historic city has known to be erupting uh, in riots uh, right from the early 17th century. So it is through these back alleys and back doors that peace get negotiated, and peace get negotiated usually by the women. So that was one interesting finding for me. The brown lines that you see over here are the absolute back alleys. As I said, we call them chainis, and we say this is where they are there so that um, air can move from the poorhouses. But I found that these are the areas where human waste is thrown because there were no toilets, or used to be thrown because there were no toilets. And this is where people whose job was to collect human waste would enter at night and leave uh, directly onto the main road without entering into the pores or the sacred spaces. When we talk about values in historic cities, we usually do not get into the details of whose values are we talking about, and uh, whose heritage and whose memories are we trying to preserve? So, uh, getting into, I found many of these examples where women would use these internal chalks and open spaces as practically an extension to their house. Uh, this is where they will be hanging out. Uh, some sometimes because they come and buy the subsidies, or sometimes it is uh, just hanging out. This is a very telling photograph where you'll see that this is the gate of the khadki, and just outside the gate there is the pan ka galla where there are a lot of men hanging there, and it is the women will find a space inside, usually in these khadkis that are safe for them. However, what I found was that uh, after certain certain riots, or after certain efforts of directing, both were the reasons for different places, for directing tourists in a particular way, for curating a walk for tourists, or in order to make sure that the communities feel a sense of safety. Uh, there are the back alleys and the back lanes are covered like this, and the structure of how city gets navigated is has completely changed. Uh, in my uh, research and in my book, I kind of look at this question of equity, where I say that, and I specifically focus on equity amongst people who live there, and the people who visit, and the people like us who want to designate things as heritage. Uh, I kind of looked into the idea that how each person, depending on what is at stake, uh, of ours in the city. Uh, how do we see heritage, or what do we value? And invariably, for the same place, different people have different meanings. This is not just in Ahmedabad or in India or in cities that are in this part of the world, but in a way, it is a global issue where we would find this is a protest in Barcelona that does not, or not in Barcelona, in Venice, that does not want tourists in their cities, and does not want their places to be taken away for consumption. Uh, After studying these studies that I did were between 2014 and 2015. In 2016 and 17, I studied the uh, Hriday scheme, which was the National Heritage City Development and Augmentation Yojana. Uh, the scheme was applied to 12 cities, and it looked at augmenting the physical infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, economic infrastructure, and the social infrastructure of historic zones or heritage zones that were identified in the city. Hriday was a very good promise. It was one of the first schemes that sought to look at historic cities as living places, not just for consumption, but also for augmenting infrastructure and introducing issues of quality of life for the people who lived there. However, most of the project, I'm not saying all, but most of this there's a research that we did on all the 12 cities. There were many people who were part of this research. The work was curated and edited by Gurmeet Rai, me, and Rutul Joshi, Professor Rutul Joshi from CEPT. Champaka was a part of this discussion, also wrote a chapter for this. And uh, we kind of reflected that while Hriday as a scheme promised a different understanding of the city, for the first time, uh, the promise was that the historic cities will not be seen in isolation from the rest of the city, but the infrastructure will be augmented so that it gets integrated and becomes part of the larger, say, urban economy. uh, the final projects were essentially beautification projects in most of the cases. I usually joke that these projects are uh, most of the heritage projects are about making heritage facades, heritage paving, heritage dustbins, heritage lamps. This is a joke that I start with sometimes in my classes as well. Unfortunately, many of the projects were became like that, and these projects, whether it is the city of Ahmedabad or the projects that got over in 2019, became a template for how we work with our historic cities. Um, my reflections at that time were what does heritage mean and why do we conserve? For the people, heritage means a sense of place. Place as a space felt, understood, and associated with, where people know their presence. Uh, a sense of place where people see the right to be in the political sense of being part of a social world. Dolores Hayden, in her book, explains Power of Place, explains this very beautifully, where she says uh, that uh, and we looked at how women engage with cities, that depending on the right of engagement of people, and if we take women in a city as an example, the way the city allows you to inhabit uh, and access is the way it shows you your place. So if a city will, a bad city will have a woman's place carved out in a very derogatory and a political way. Um, sense of place also as places of cultural creation, uh, perception of shared history, uh, sense of place as ontological security, where each one of us would have a psychological attachment and a place attachment to the sites or to the places we belong to. To give you an example, there was this one research where I did where I found that people taking a certain route to uh, go to from their home to office. And if there are certain places of worship coming by their way, or certain places that are important to them coming on the way, they will always take a slight detour, even if they have to access them. Uh, this resonates with me a lot because all of us, if we really think about it, have little rituals and little routines in our lives. When they get disturbed, uh, we feel bad about it. The example that I give to my students is that if you go to the library and sit in the same place every day, it's not your place, you don't own it. But if you go and sit there every day, if for some reason somebody else is sitting there when you went, and it will disturb you. You will suddenly have to find a new place to sit and you will suddenly feel a little disoriented. This, in a much amplified way, works when a city changes or does not take the ontological security as a part of the transformation discussion. A sense of place is also linked to the possibility of producing new meanings. People feel part of a city when they are able to participate in any meaning creation. Projects like Bhadra or projects like the Heritage Street project do not necessarily take that into account. Hriday scheme had a portion of community engagement, and certain cities did that very well, where the discussion of what this transformation should be should become a part of the should give them that sense of place, give the citizens a sense of place. Uh, Having access to contestations of meanings and association and sense of citizenship. These are the different ways. Sense of citizenship, I usually give an example of Ellis Island, that when you go to Ellis Island in New York, you are taken through the history of how an immigrant becomes a citizen in America. And that entire journey is about how did it happen in the 18th century and how does it happen now. Uh, I went there only as a tourist, but my sister lives there. And after going through that entire exhibition, this was in 2014, so before the politics of America the way it is. Uh, by the end of it, I felt uh, I was assured that, and I could understand why my sister feels. that she is a citizen of America. Because that entire journey of going through the meanings of being an American and how does one become an American and why does one become an American just through an experience of one island was quite phenomenal. We oftentimes relegate museums to being uh, just these places where objects are kept, but oftentimes well curated museums do that. Oftentimes, well curated city tours do that. So that is an important part of what sense of place is. In most of the projects that I studied, uh, sense of place was, however, taken as an aesthetic concept that talks about the personality of the place. And that is implied in the heritage narrative. So, for example, like we looked at in Badra, that, well, in the 17th century, Mendelssohn said that this is how this place was. So we are going to go back to that particular sense of place, that particular scale, that particular aesthetic, without worrying about. Uh, since then, there have been layers of meanings that have been added to this place that gives people a sense of place, a sense of meaning, and a sense of citizenship. And the freedom movement being a very important part of that. Patra Plaza today does not talk about the freedom movement and the site as a place for many of these activities of freedom movement having taken place. Uh, Cities and heritage, urban heritage, or heritage in general as cultural resource, uh, questions of cultural innovations, questions of public histories, public memories of diverse groups, knowledge of cultural history. One of the primary objective of conserving cultural heritage is to ensure that diverse meanings and diverse histories get conserved so that everybody who lives there, or almost everybody who lives there, even the people who migrated, feel a part of that place. Uh, Unfortunately, the most of the historic cities are curated as places of cultural exchange through self-conscious elite experience. Invariably, we will hear about how a particular in Ahmedabad or in any other city, how a particular king did in a particular certain things, built this, or a moneyed person did that, or how a rich person lived in a certain way. We rarely talk about difficult pasts, difficult questions, and through that, uh, giving people the right to uh, express their cultural diversity. Culture as a cultural resource, heritage also gives opportunity for changing the cultural heritage. Not everything that we have inherited is equally valuable. Some of the things we must remember, once again, going back to the narrative of the role of women. And once again, I oftentimes say that if I was playing my traditional role, I would be in a farm, possibly serving food to my husband. I would not be sitting here and giving this lecture. Many of us are here outside our cultural role. The access to heritage as cultural resource, the knowledge of it, also gives us the ability and the empowerment to be able to change it. And I think that is an important aspect of cultural heritage that we must remember. Cultural heritage as economic resource, their livelihood networks, their right to economic productions of meaning, right to choice of employment. Invariably, here we say that in the historic city, I used to hear and I continue to hear that we are not able to conserve because the carpenter's son does not want to remain a carpenter. Of course, he does. I think we need to come out of our own understanding or our own trap of why would people choose certain employment and why would they not? And the right of people to choose a different employment. There are world over uh, trainings and guilds that allow people who are not necessarily born into a particular way of doing things, get trained into that, and people who are born into something do something else. So once again, that is something that we are not very conscious about. Instead, we are looking at heritage as an economic resource simply for what it allows to how it allows to be consumed for tourism, uh, and how it allows to recreate an authentic experience for other people to consume. Recently, I've also heard narratives of historic cities as real estate and how the land can become, or the parcels of land can become a way of how heritage can become a driver of new economy. The lessons that I learned at that time were that historic cities and cultural practices cannot be static. They did not originate in a particular time and in a specific form, and they continue to change. Heritage values are not intrinsic. They are not there. They are given, attributed by the agent of change based on their present worldview. They are mostly triggered through process of change. Conservation is not a passive phenomena of preserving a place as it is, but it is an action of changing the status quo of a place. It can have positive and negative impacts on place, like any process of change and development. I have continued to review projects around historic cities since my last detailed analysis of Ahmedabad and Redel. Most of these continue to be on project basis, and we seem to have given up on the idea that transformations of historic city can be systematically thought about as a matter of policy. We seem to have doubled down on the idea that the future of historic cities lie only in consumption of economy that valorize historic aesthetics over meaningful engagement with history. The joke that I make about heritage paving, heritage lamp, heritage dustbins, recently I saw that being repeated as very earnestly in a social media post as if it was an achievement. This reminds me of a book that actually Dr. Champaka Rajgopal shared with me a couple of decades ago, a book by Michael Sorkin on variations of theme parks. And we invariably, or the current practice, the way we are engaging with historic cities, we are creating heritage theme parks that are neither true to conserving historic knowledge systems, nor do they respond to the question of quality of life, be in a modern way. So I would dare to say that we are not actually in the conundrum of whether we want to engage with the past or whether we want a modern life. We have abandoned both. We are creating theme parks at the moment. The world has moved on, however. Uh, the world that engages with uh, thoughts of Geddes, thoughts of Giovanni, the Main Street projects of America, and the discourses that engage with the question of value, they have started looking at urban heritage from the perspective of how that they can be repositories of knowledge and for resilience. How can new life and new meanings relate to the historic meanings for uh, engaging and layering the city for the future generations? Last year, once again, Gurmeet, Jayashree Bardhan, and Vidya, we did a compendium with NIUA and cities on climate action and built heritage. We looked at examples around the world on how, and this compendium is available online. We looked at examples around the world where people were engaging with historic cities through digital tools. They were engaging with historic cities for the purposes of salvaging the historic knowledge. They were engaging with historic cities for the purposes of tapping into the cultural ecosystem that works with climate change better than the modern systems do. We had a close to 100, and we have close to 180 examples across the world that you can look into this database. The key points that we found in this was that I think we should move away from the question of urban heritage as just a question of historic value. We should recognize the intersection between climate change and cultural heritage as more urgent. Uh, just before we started this discussion, we were talking about how cities are facing extreme climates, extreme weathers, extreme conditions, Delhi, including Delhi. And then there are considerations where people may have to move out, even if temporarily. Uh, Ahmedabad, cities like Ahmedabad are also not very far away. The IPCC reports have identified most of our cities and the vulnerabilities in most of our cities that we will have to recognize. We have to recognize the impacts of climate change on cultural heritage, appreciate cultural heritage as a resource. In many cities, we found, for example, there was one example from Medina where there was existing knowledge amongst the people who lived there on how to quickly build boats from the bamboo that was available over there when there is flooding. So, almost while as a modern practice it had vanished, there was a process of revival of that particular knowledge of building temporary boats for when flash flooding happens in that region. Many of this knowledge can become a resource for us as a survival resource. We need scientific process for diagnosis. We need systematic planning and monitoring. I think we are already too late in doing that. Uh, we need nature-based mitigation measures. We need adaptation of heritage places, not just conservation of them. We need multi-stakeholder engagement and capacity building, embracing digital technologies for climate action, and considering existing and past frameworks and resources as springing points. Some of these frameworks that we already have are valuable, are important. One of them could be the impact assessment process, which is in its has matured for monuments, but for cities, it's quite nascent stage, which we can develop and work upon. The toolkit that following this, we developed a toolkit of climate action for historic cities in India. Once again, available online, but the toolkit contains these answers to these 6 questions. Which cities can use the toolkit? Who in the cities will use the toolkit? Who will prepare the framework? What are the stages of toolkit and how much time would it take and what resources would be needed? The toolkit essentially looks at the intersection of climate change and cultural heritage, answers the question of how does climate change affect cultural heritage and how can cultural heritage be a resource for climate action? And how do we propose? And this becoming a framework for conservation, for mitigation, for adaptation, and possibly also planning for loss of cultural heritage. I will end here, and if was, I'll be happy to take on the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jigna Desai. It's wonderful to see the many bold assertions that you've made through your talk. I can see over the last 30 years, I've seen your work evolve. And it's really wonderful to be able to engage in this conversation with you. Before we move into a wider discussion, I had one question which I thought I would put out there. And I would also request my colleagues at the office at the Center for Policy Research to share any questions that they might have. What I thought we could begin with is to reflect on the critical juncture where we are at today, where we confront multiple forms of uncertainties, whether it's restructuring of power relationships internationally, or it's rapid technology change, climate change, which you already invoked, new political and societal demands to restore a different sort of a glorious past today. So in this context of multiple uncertainties, how would you situate the imagination of heritage conservation, which is also a dynamic process, as you rightly pointed? The second question I had, which is in relationship to this, the imagination of a glorious past, is about any views that you might have on the politics of nostalgia. These are 2 questions that I thought it would be good to set our conversations out with. And I'd like to request my colleague at CPR at Delhi, at the Delhi office. Pushpaji, would you have any questions to share right away? Any thoughts or comments? We can't hear you. Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, this mic doesn't work. I said thank you, Champaka, and Thank you, Jigna, for that very interesting presentation. I must say, you have looked at these projects as from an architect's point of view and perhaps from a point of view of historical urban historian perspective. But I, living in the current world and being a bit more concerned about people, I wanted to know what is the impact of rejuvenation of these historic areas or different at different points of time when these areas change. How do they impact people who stay back? Some move out, like from Ahmedabad, some people would have gone to Pakistan from that area, as you have said, but some have stayed back. And that impact would be would vary according to community, social group, and income group, etc. So I don't know whether you have done any studies or other people have done any studies that could talk about the impact on the people who have remained. And similarly, what is the impact on people's livelihoods that you have touched upon? And did the livelihoods improve through rejuvenation or get changed or got destroyed? So if you could answer these questions from people's perspective, I would be quite happy. Thank you.
All right, I'll take your question first, I think, if you don't mind. I think your question on impact of rejuvenation uh, so my studies of the changes of the historic cities of Ahmedabad, historic city of Ahmedabad has been, as I said, from 2011 onwards, what has happened. But there are other studies before that by many sociologists who have looked at how the historic grain of the city has changed with every every skirmish or every riot. So be it pre-partition riots, the partition riots, there was another major demographic change that happened in 1985 that changed things. And then, of course, the early 2000 riots. So each of these kind of violences have changed the demographic of the city. It's not, as you rightly pointed out, not my area of expertise, but there have been many studies around this, which kind of on the historic cities, which say that the grain of the historic city, which was earlier on that every pore would be every pore would have a very different cultural milieu, and the next door pore could be a very different cultural milieu or religious milieu. It's just because of the architecture of it that they could exist next to each other. So today also, for example, in Vanyanipur, you will find, which is the Banyanipur, you'll find a mosque, or you will find in Jamalpur, you'll find a Derasar. So historically, the grain has been was quite small. So every region had different communities. Every pore had different communities living in it. Every policy change, every violence has changed this demographic, and this has been studied a lot by sociologists. So I will not get into that. I will get into the question of how this idea of heritage conservation has changed the way um, people live in the city. So I think what I've found is that there are certain areas of the city which are tourist friendly, where there is a lot of economic impetus for creating heritage walks, creating bed and breakfasts, creating tourism-based uh, economies. They are changing fast. They are not as fast as the economy, but as the large-scale cities' economies are, but fast enough to affect the people. The Gangadiyani port that I was studying, when I started my studies, I had certain studies that were done by some students in 1990s. The port had the port has around 90 houses. All the 90 houses were occupied by people who either were renting or were living there. With there were two things that happened in that area. One was that because of the quality of life that was imagined in the old city in the 90s, in the early 90s, when we were studying here, the old city was a place that would be extremely congested. Was one of the cities that one of the parts of the cities that is extremely polluted. You don't go to the old city. Was what we all when we were studying uh, kind of imagined, unless you want to get trapped into traffic and unless you want to get trapped into pollution. So a lot of people moved out at that time, and certain small scale industries moved in. Those small scale industries instigated the first set of gentrification, where it became a cycle that as industries move in, the people would move out. When I started my studies in early 2010, so 2011, 2012, there was still around this bed and breakfast and the Heritage Street project was going on. There was still 50% of houses were still occupied. Uh, the gentrification that has been caused by this heritage economy, because now there is a restaurant there is a hotel there's another hotel just across, there are walks there, there are a lot of tourists coming in there. At the moment, I believe out of the 90, only 10 houses are occupied by the people who live in. So there is that kind of a gentrification going on in the areas that are having an impetus of tourism. I'm not getting into the question of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, because people also move out in search of better life. Um, the other areas which are not considered to be tourist friendly for whatever reasons, those areas are unchanged, and unchanged to the extent that the basic infrastructure is also something that is not considered for those areas. So, historic city of Ahmedabad is not functioning as a homogeneous whole. There are parts of the city where there are what do you say? The parts of the city where there is slow destruction because of tourism, because you want to show certain kind of heritage to tourism. And the other areas, there is slow destruction because of dereliction, because nobody is taking care of those properties. So the historic city of Ahmedabad, the 5.5 square kilometers of the city, kind of exist on both extremes simultaneously. So that is an interesting part of the way I see the city functioning. It may actually be something that gives us an opportunity to work with, because if the entire city is going in one direction, it's very difficult to put in checks and balances. Uh, if once again, if we consider it systematically. I hope I've answered your question, or you can just
Yes, you have.
add
Very well.
additional
Thank you.
questions.
Yes.
Champaka, I'll go back to your question. I remember one. I don't remember the later one, but I remember you can ask it again. But the first one where you said that how, given the new world where everything is the way the political narratives have changed, the technological narratives are extremely dynamic and extremely changing very fast. How do I see the processes of conservation, or where do I see the processes of conservation going? I think in the world we live in and with the technologies we have, while there is a lot of urgency to look at the historic cities, um, there is also a need to think before we act. There is a need to slow down our urge to preserve the past. Because I don't think as a society we have resolved our relationship with our past. It's not been an easy relationship. And we've not resolved those relationships. Even a historic city like Ahmedabad, or even in the Hriday cities that we looked at, we are not yet ready to look at recent histories post-colonial histories in a way that we can reconcile with them. So I think we need to spend more time in uh, studying, researching, and digital technologies can help us quicken that process. So, for example, we've been using LIDAR scanning as a way of documenting heritage since the past 4 years, and I'm kind of at the moment exploring that. Once that is one is that it gives us a record that is unbiased, it just records whatever is there. It once again there are questions of rights and questions of consent that go with it, which we are working on, and globally people are working on. But it gives us data without an expert bias. The potential of analyzing that data through machine learning is something that we've not tapped into. We are already tapping into the artificial intelligence for the imagination of a past. So we are creating imagined pasts based on that data. But we are not using that data for scientific research that may help us make decisions on conservation better. So I think we need to have a view on that. We need to have an attitude to technology. Just now, I don't think as a society we have an attitude to past or we have an attitude to technology. And I think we need to have those discussions more often in spaces which are not necessarily burdened by uh, project decisions, just discussions. I think we are not having those enough. And I think we need to do that if we are to if we are to engage with conservation properly. Um, the question of where it is going to go is a very different. Where I see it may go if we don't engage is that I think we should stop having the aspiration of engaging with heritage and history in uh, with its authentic meanings, because if we are not willing to investigate and engage in histories in a more and technology in a more abstract and scientific manner first. I'm sorry, I did not write down your second question, so I don't remember it.
We can come back to that. It was about the politics of nostalgia. But in the interest of many questions that have come, we could probably move on to the audience's questions. In relation to what you were discussing about, the tensions between sort of, if I may say, over touristification versus everyday lives. There's a question by Elif Bali who says, "Thank you for your very thought-provoking presentation. Speaking as someone outside the field, I found it extremely illuminating. As residents of a historic city like Istanbul, we often find ourselves fragmented and divided when we're trying to engage in decision-making processes around urban transformation. The city, with its history and potential, seems to exist beyond everyday life, while we as residents have sometimes conflicting interests between preserving our identities and responding to daily needs. Given our limited knowledge, especially about planning processes and central policies, what realistic pathways to participation do you see for ordinary urban residents?"
Well, that's a fantastic and a very hopeful question. So I will answer that question with hope and certain examples that are happening around the world, and some little initiatives that we have started with the hope of that kind of engagement. So one of the discussions that is happening across the world, not just related to historic cities, but also related to architecture and its proximity to the questions of it's if I have to extrapolate, and the architects in the group may resonate with what I'm trying to do here, is that we also tend to think about architecture and design in a larger than life manner. We tend to think about it as an abstract conceptual thought that is sometimes devoid of day-to-day impacts and day-to-day lives and day-to-day realities of people. There is this entire movement which is picking up pretty rapidly, and I'm very hopeful about it, which is known as the movement of radical proximity with built environment, or designing or thinking about built environment with radical proximity, where people who are designing, they situate themselves in the sites and in the places that they are engaging with. So they may not be living there, but they would engage with an active stake. So many a times architects would tie up with an NGO who's working there in that particular area, or tie up with a resident group who is there as partners. So it's not like architects go and settle in their sites, but they tie up with the people as partners who are very closely related to those places. They are aware of the day-to-day, the daily life questions. They are aware of although the larger risks of climate change that they've seen with time, risks of how things are changing around them. There is a bodily awareness of their built environment, which is now being considered as a very important knowledge that can aid design, and it can aid decisions of urban transformation. There are groups in Africa that do that very actively, groups in Chile that do that very actively. Uh, uh, we've started this small initiative here, which we call Site Schools, where we tie up with the custodians of historic sites or historic places. There could be a small house or a small building or a small institution, but we tie up with the custodians as partners, and we engage in transformation of that particular site and its area through that partnership. So there is a constant awareness of what is what would what is the narrative of what is, I won't use the word need, but what is the um, uh, what is the bodily knowledge that people who live there bring. uh, it is invariably posed in the world of practice. It is invariably, this knowledge and this understanding is invariably posed as people who live in historic cities are invariably labeled as people who don't know about their own heritage. And I have always contested that, and I hope to continue to contest that argument, that everybody knows about their own history. Everybody knows about their own past. Of what relationship that they want with that and how they want to negotiate it, it may be very different from the way we imagine it to be negotiated as a collective. And it is that conversation that becomes extremely important, an open conversation from all the people who have rights, who have stake of knowledge as well as stake of actual livelihood and money. I think those conversations become very important. Large projects, unfortunately, do not, uh, especially in our context, uh, because the speed in which we expect our cities to transform, large projects are not given the luxury of time for this kind of engagement. Usually, even for a small project that we engage in, I usually say we will need 3 years just to understand how to go about this transformation. The transformation may start in the third year. I don't think we are affording ourselves the luxury of that time. And I'm not saying that all projects have to have that luxury, but uh, I think, unfortunately, what happens that, and we've seen that in most of our historic cities, or at least the ones that I've studied, that transformations are not cognizant of the lived uh, realities and the day-to-day embodied meanings. Uh, like we saw in Bhadra, the sites come back the full circle and become what the people want it to become eventually. So I think it is we need we need to shift that gear, maybe slow down and think before we jump into large projects.
Thank you. Slowing down and thoughtfulness, certainly most critical in this complex era we're in. There are several questions, and I'll try and club them in the interest of time. there are a couple of questions pertaining to the Hriday scheme. Jinal Savla has a question about whether you can describe what an ideal project under Hriday would have looked like for you. Jinal Savla says, I can imagine physical restorations under Hriday are only the first step. That's one point. The second is about again, there was something on Hriday, which please do go ahead and I can come back for about the next question.
That is a very, very difficult question. But yes, I'll be very honest with you. We had thought about it collectively when we were looking at. I'm just on the other slide looking at my slide where I was talking about what Hriday promised. So when we were an ideal project, Hriday promised an ideal project. If you really look at the Hriday outlines, it says that historic cities need to become a part. So the first position it takes is that if you look at all the uh, master plans of cities, like the Auda map of Ahmedabad or the urban development plan, historic cities are these little pink blobs. At least in Ahmedabad, it's a pink blob, which you call Gamtal or inner city. And no streets are drawn, no zoning is done, nothing is thought about that particular part. Hriday takes on to that and says we need to think of these also as how they are zoned, or what is the micro zoning, what is the kind of physical infrastructure that these cities have, and what can be augmented. This is something that JNNURM also said. The entire project was about augmenting infrastructure for not just historic cities, but for cities, and not just infrastructure. Both JNNURM and Hriday speak about augmenting institutional infrastructure, augmenting social infrastructure and economic infrastructure. So essentially, in nowhere it clearly says you need to conserve buildings, or you need to do street pavings, or you need to have heritage lights, or you need heritage dustbins. Nowhere does it say that. It was left to the imagination of the person who is thinking of that city to what would be this imagination. Many of them tried. I think it fell flat for two reasons. One is that Hriday mentions, and JNNURM both mention tourism, mention visitation as one of the primary reasons why this needs to be augmented. So all of this infrastructure then by default became about tourism because it's an easy thing to deal with. In a historic city, it's easier to deal with tourism than it is to deal with people who live there. Because in order to deal with people who live there, you'll have to understand the people who live there, and no funding gives us money to do that or time to do that. So I think in an ideal world, both of these projects should have, I would say, restoration of buildings and restoration of streets should be the last thing in Hriday. The first discussions should be about what is this infrastructure that we are talking about. Well, very simply, if we just simply look at mobility infrastructure, I think Dwarka looked at and Amritsar looked at mobility infrastructure as well as the sanitation infrastructure. What is the augmentation needed for the people who live there and the new people that we are introducing in these places? How will we need to augment that infrastructure so that there is less environmental burden on the existing capacity of the historic city? For example, if we are saying that now this is a heritage city and new people are coming, most of these heritage cities were pilgrim cities. So there were already a lot of people coming. The studies were meant to be about what is the capacity of drinking water that this city has, and how can we augment that so that when tourists come here, the city is not burdened with additional water pressure. How does waste get taken care of? How does sewage get taken care of? What is the livelihood and how the livelihoods are augmented? I think those were the discussions that many of these cities started with. I think till the point of zoning, many of these cities did that. I think when it came to translation to an actual project on site, which required rightly so for the implementation agency to work with the local governance, that capacity was where the major gap was. I think, Champaka, you identify in your chapter that pretty well, that it's that point that the translation stops and you just implement what the city can. So there is an ambition and there is a capacity to implement that ambition, and that was the gap. So in order to eventually implement the project, you pick up projects that the local capacities can carry out because the capacity building budget is very low. So I think, or there is no time for capacity building or no patience for capacity building. So I think that is how I would respond to that. I think uh, restoration projects should have been outcome of the Hriday project, not part of the Hriday project, according to.
And that's
Unless there, unless there
Go
is
ahead.
a historic infrastructure. I think in a couple of cities, they picked up historic infrastructure to be augmented. In that case, it is a restoration of historic infrastructure, which is important. Yeah, so.
And the question of capacity is critical because we're not just interpreting capacity in terms of human resource capacities and technical capacities here. We're looking at the ability of the state to implement policies effectively,
Yeah.
to interpret them to context and implement them effectively that are inclusive, as well as there are possibilities to sustain these interventions. But it's also, we're looking at state capacity here as the capacity of the state to build sustained relationships. We're talking about social relationships, economic relationships, administrative relationships, and political relationships.
Yeah.
So these translate into accountabilities eventually. But what you brought up as, the importance of recognizing communities and engaging with communities in the Hriday scheme, that sort of perfectly segues us into the next question that Archana Singh has brought up. She says, as you have mentioned about Hriday and how they cover only small portions of community engagements in their projects, do you think including communities living in historic cities in policy making of conservation will not only lead to architectural conservation, but also cultural conservation? Are you not sort of freezing their identities? But at the same time, communities are the ones who are altering historical architecture through incorporating modern appliances. What do you think about this paradox? How to make them part of conservation while they're also moving forward, embracing different forms of modernizations?
I don't see that as a paradox. I think I have a slightly different, and many, it's not just me, many have a very different view on conservation of culture. I don't think cultures can be conserved. Cultures can be remembered, cultures can be practiced, and with each set of practice or each action of practice, it changes a little. So the differences between the pace with which it changes, difference in acceptance is the pace with which it changes. If it changes slow, and I'll give you example of that as well. If it changes slowly, with every little tweak, with every practice, it becomes a part of an evolving culture. If it changes suddenly, it's the resonance of the meanings lost is higher. So I'll give you an example of a community of crafts community in Kutch, where there's a community that works with uh, with lacquer and covers the wooden objects in lacquer. Their way of working is that they have small lathe, which is kind of small enough for one hand to roll the lathe and another hand to apply lacquer to the wood. When they do so the way the practice works is, I think there's a cultural practice. This is a tribal community that used to migrate and used to be nomads before partition, but after partition, because they were nomads between Sindh and Kutch, but after partition, one part of them found themselves in Kutch, another part of them may have found themselves in Sindh. They kind of work with the way, or one person is working on the lathe, one person is rotating with their left hand, and with the right hand, they are applying the lacquer, which is made out of natural colors and rubber, which also they themselves make. When they are applying, the speed or the pressure with which they apply the lacquer creates patterns. Now, with time, with people like us going and valorizing that craft and finding it beautiful and finding it precious, they started creating different kinds of patterns, a little which we won't call traditional. They started using mixing and matching different colors. So people like us who have supposedly urban taste do not like the green and the bright green and the bright red and the bright yellow. They will create slightly pastel colors by adding a little black and adding a little white in order to make it appealing for us. And the community still felt that this was part of their tradition. They were still practicing their culture and practicing their tradition. Um, there was one movement at some point where an organization said that you can produce this much faster. And there's another community in Sankheda who does that, who makes furnitures out of lacquer. You may have seen Sankheda furniture as traditional Gujarati furniture, but they use a machine lathe. When the moment you move from a hand lathe to a machine lathe, the size limitation goes away because you're not doing anything by hand. You're only applying that thing by hand. The machine is rotating. So you can actually make furniture. You can make a large bed, stand, roll, and do all of that. Uh, this community said at that point that this is changing our culture. This is taking away the meaning from our culture because the moment you bring in a machine, our art and our culture lies in creating these patterns. The machine does not allow us to change the speed or change the pressure of our hand to create patterns. And that is the shift that was disturbing for them. They went back to their handheld lathes. So I think this is how I see culture, that at any given point of time, it is what the people who are practicing that culture and embodying that knowledge uh, are what they think it is at that point is the culture. A forced change may be extremely disturbing for them. And a change that is slow but accepted is and accepted as a part of the continuity by the people who have the knowledge, not by you and me, by people who practice that bodily knowledge. It's their body who that is applying the pressure, working with the lathe, working with the color, working with the wood. And I think Tim Ingold's perception of the environment, who's an anthropological perspective on this, says that it is that bodily knowledge that is at the center of production of cultural objects, production of that material culture. I think this has to do with also generally as cultural practices, even when they are not a non-material culture, like how we talk, how we play, how we dance our garbas, or how we wear our clothes. What is accepted to us? I think I'm still wearing a shirt, a pant, and speaking in English. I still think I'm pretty much part of the Indian culture because I have made this a part of my culture. So I think that is this notion of culture. We can conserve the material culture, evidences of material culture from the past. But to expect that we are going to conserve practices, we may conserve the memory of the practice in terms of a narrative or in terms of a museumized piece. But I don't think we can perform tradition uh, without getting into into the blurry lines of whose knowledge is it that we are practicing.
Yes, indeed. We just had the same discussion in studio this morning. So I hope my students are listening as well. We have two questions which are pertaining to heritage walks in Ahmedabad. There's one by Deepesh Gulgulia. What's your opinion about Debashish Naik's Heritage Walks project in Ahmedabad? Such projects are needed in other historic cities as well. The second part is also a question. Do you think such projects are needed in other historic cities as well? The other question is from Tanya Debnath. What do you think about the role of heritage walks in preserving historic knowledge and create a sense of belonging?
All right. I think heritage walks are great triggers to start the discourse on heritage conservation, or especially at an urban level, where you're not talking about one building or one monument. Heritage walks trigger a continued narrative of a story of a city. So I think they're great triggers. What they also do is that heritage walks force the inhabitants of those places also to think about their places or the places that they live in. And connecting to the first question here, they force the inhabitants to think about their own places and their own history in a slightly non-familiar way, which is important. It's important to think about, it's kind of anthropologically proven that it is important to think about your day-to-day life and how you relate to your history or your past in a slightly defamiliarized way. It creates a healthier relationship. So I think from that point of view, these heritage walks are extremely valuable as triggers. There is, however, a caveat that I will put over here. Heritage walks that no city should have one heritage walk. No city should have only one narrative around one heritage walk. A good narrative of a city would have multiple walks. Every city, the smallest of city, can offer many stories. It's important to curate multiple walks, and for each walk, multiple stories. So once again, I'll give you an example of the New York bus tour, heritage tour. Is when you get into the bus goes through that. There are 5 routes of bus. You can pick a route. One is a museums route, another is a Central Park route, the third is a Harlem route, the fourth is a Bronx route. So different parts of New York. But when you get into the bus, I'm just saying, I'm sure this is in many places. It's just that I was quite excited. I kind of did this for the first time and was very excited about it. Um, Once you get into the bus, depending upon who the guide is, the narrative changes. So when I started, and I'm sure you know that these are hop on, hop off. You can get up at any point and get in at any other point. So you can walk a little or bus a little. And when this was an entire day for me. I started on one route. When I started, there was one person, one guide who was narrating a particular history. That person was a migrant from Italy. And he spoke about how there is a little Italy here, and this is how when Italians came to New York, this is what they did. You see that place over there. This is where this gang war happened, and this is where this mafia came. And there was a kind of an entire story around that. Once I got off and I got on, it was a different bus, a different guide. That person was a migrant from Mexico. And that person was talking about how Mexicans relate to New York and what are the important part of the city that Mexicans relate to. So every time I got onto that bus, which is the same route, I got a different version of history. I think that is important. London does it very differently. London has these channels, and it asks you to choose from one of the channels. One will be this version of history, another will be that version of history, and you can choose which version you want to go with as you go around. I think it's important to do that. It's important to have various versions of narratives on Heritage Walk. In absence of that, kind of we start becoming we start conforming our biases, and the city starts being seen as this little stagnant place with one glorious narrative, and as if nothing else is important in that city. And this is when people who live there get alienated, because it has nothing to do with how they engage with the city.
Thank you, Jigna. That was very refreshing. I have there are several questions. We should take them in the order of how we receive them. But there's also a very interesting question from dear colleague Malini Krishnan Koti. which I'll come to a little later. It might be interesting to actually invite her to enter into a more into a longer discussion. But prior to that, we have Rachna Atri, who had raised her hand previously. Rachna, if you're here, we'd be happy to bring you into a discussion as well. Would you like to engage in a conversation? Yes, Rachna, are you able to unmute yourself?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. I
Hi.
must say, fantastic. It was fantastic to hear you, Professor Desai. And
Thank you.
where I was able to connect was that having lived in Ghaziabad, I was trying to historically record. I'm 50, so I was trying to record from the historical Ghaziabad city and the time period where I come in and the time prior and the future, considering it is part of Delhi National Region. And it was when I heard you today, there were so many answers to why, and what I've asked for is remembering this town during the time of COVID, how people, because now I'm not staying in Ghaziabad, but trying to research on it, how COVID as a time of crisis made us reflect on the nostalgia, you know? And when you look at the town today, its challenges of traffic, the life, and the smaller city area, a walled city area, we would want to have it, yet want it better. And a lot of, well, now, if I was to extrapolate it to the diasporic peer group, this thing of wanting to come back to the city, but being I don't know, like that hopelessness, and then the system. Where how does one deals with the system? And I'm not an architect, but I can understand the materiality, how the materiality of the built environment we have to deal with. May I have your response, please?
I'll start with your example of what COVID did to us in terms of how we started viewing our cities. Yes, I agree with you that because there was a certain uh, kind of, because the cities were empty and we could see them in the form and not in the mess. There was this uh, kind of understanding of the materiality of the city that was extremely that kind of brought back this idea that these are important things. Once again, I'll go to the example of Ahmedabad because it's a city that I observe as I live here. During COVID, there were a couple of things that happened here. Uh, because it is a dense city and because people live pretty close by. Uh, but that uh, I don't think the historic city of Ahmedabad was the only place where there were hotspots. There were other hotspots as well. Historic city of Ahmedabad was one of the COVID hotspots very early on at the time of lockdown. And there were a lot of people, a lot of cases coming from historic city of Ahmedabad. Owing to its geography, the easiest thing for the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation was to say that the walled city is closed, and every street or road that comes out of the city gate had surveillance so that nobody could get in and out of the walled city. It was almost like this part of the city has to figure its own self out. Of course, there were that gave the administration kind of the what do you say, the control of being able to send in required medicines, required vaccinations. So it was able to kind of do that very targetedly. Hospitalizations were done extremely efficiently because of that cordoning. But for the people who lived there, imagine for 3 months, you cannot go in and out of that area. You cannot, even after the lockdown was opened for other parts, historic city remained in the lockdown for a much longer time. Uh, what I found was very interesting. I found that the cultural institutions, the religious institutions, which the small religious institutions, they were the one who sprung up for with innovative ideas on how to deal with this isolation. So there is this small trust called Jigna Trust in Ahmedabad, the Ahmedabad Waqf Committee, the Swaminarayan Temple, certain NGOs that are the Seva that are all there. They all started these pooling of food. In a normal day-to-day life, there is a lot of resentment amongst migrants that the migrants are coming here and spoiling our cities. But during that time, everybody was stuck in there. And it was the same, the communities that were connected with these religious institutions were helping the migrants with food, with connecting them with doing certain activities together, to the extent that there were also online discussions that were held to ensure that people have somebody to talk to and they do not break down mentally. So that was an Ahmedabad that I read in histories, that the cultural institutions or the religious institutions of Ahmedabad are the ones that make the city resilient, is what I have read here. As I was saying earlier on, also that the post riots and post violence is through the back alleys that the women connect, and there is peace building exercise, and one could see a lot of that triggering because the city was left on its own. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I do feel that the historic cities. Uh, Once again, we have had administratively a quite a bit of patronizing attitude towards what historic cities ought to be. Left on their own, they know what they want to be. The people living there, they know what they value. They know how they connect. They know what is important about living in the city. And I think they know how their internal governance work. They know how their internal support systems work. And I think as mechanisms of governance, we are not tapping into that enough. We are not recognizing that.
Exactly. And may I say that, when we talk of historic city, I think in India, we are so densely populated, and our cities and the town life goes back 1500 years in most of the cases. So each of the history townships may have, 300 to 400 years of historic connect, yet
And
it
governance
may not be
systems. Yeah.
historic enough for us to consider it historic,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
maybe building nahi hai, or there is no historic marker in the textbook or the larger narrative of history. But I think the cities have such uniquely lived cultures, and those are in itself uh, beautiful. And the administrative apathy and I would say systemic laxidal attitude, and citizens do not have a response, you know to
Yeah.
to take it forward. So
Yeah. Yeah, actually,
thank
this
you.
I also respond to. Sorry, I'll just take this to the question of Hriday and the question that what would be the ideal response to the Hriday scheme. This when the building of social infrastructure, this
Hmm.
the existing social infrastructures should have been recognized and augmented in Hriday as well. That was one of the opportunities that scheme also provided.
Thank you, Jigna. I'd like to invite Dr. Malini Krishnankuti to please share her question and thoughts as well. Malini, over to you.
Thanks, Champaka. Dr. Desai, thank you for your presentation. Listening to you about historic cities, I was actually thinking that, most Indian cities have long history. A number of them have really long histories. All of them have been around, many of them have been around for so long. And yet, when we look at urban planning and the practice of urban planning, we don't see any real response or any kind of engagement with the city's history. So, urban conservation comes as an extra, or there's a separate field, and
Yeah.
it becomes a speciality and it's not integrated. So, really, what do you think needs to change to kind of integrate this kind of historical sensitivity to urban planning? It's not necessarily a conservation. The moment we talk conservation, it gets bracketed into a particular mode of looking at the city. But really,
Yeah.
that's why I'm using the word a sensitivity and a historical sensitivity when we think about any city, and when planners engage with any city. How do you think they need to go in, and what is that kind of response, and how can we have this kind of sensitivity? Yeah.
So I think all planners need to be trained in urban histories. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if planners are a subject of urban histories, but they should if they don't. In all seriousness, I think it also has a lot to do with how we teach urban conservation in most of the institutes around the world. So, as you rightly said, urban conservation is seen as a separate field. Um, that is devoid from the questions of planning or even devoid from the questions of urban design. Uh, and its processes are seen to be more aligned with the processes of monument conservation rather than aligned with planning or urban design. I think we need to address that in conservation education also more acutely. The practitioners of urban conservation need there are very few practitioners of urban conservation, for example, can successfully do a wayfinding exercise and understand how the city functions as landmarks and nodes and as a system. I don't think the conservation experts are trained or educated into that field at all. So I think the field needs to pivot a bit there. Uh, Having said that, we also, in our understanding of urban conservation, often look at practices, even when we look at planning practices, we look at that in isolation of the way the historic cities' mechanisms are functioning at the moment. We don't build on what is existing. So, for example, once again, going back to the city of Ahmedabad, if I have to draw the first example or identify the first example of conscious conservation, it happened in 1856. And it happened as a planning project. The first effort to conserve the fort walls of the city happened through a town wall committee that was part of the newly formed, or that became the newly formed municipal corporation, that worked on the entire fort wall, the repair of it, and created accesses for water to move out, not clog at certain places. So that exercise was not just a conservation exercise. The fort wall is an infrastructure, and the exercise of the city, and the exercise was to uh, as much to augment the conditions of the fort wall so that this inner city can function better. The next exercise in Ahmedabad of conservation was by Patrick Giddes, who identified once again which are the junctions where the city can expand so that it does not congest. This was in 1916, so that it doesn't congest inside the fort walls. Where can you open up? Where can you create these kind of little breathers so that the city can breathe out a little, and at the same time ensure that the important streets are conserved and the fourth wall is conserved. So there is an entire Patrickidis plan of the city of Ahmedabad, which was also as such an urban conservation project from a planning perspective. So I don't think these ideas did not exist in the way we think about cities. There have been attitudes to conservation within the discussions of planning. It's just that I don't think we are looking at those attitudes seriously anymore, or we are looking at the question of what is valuable in a city and what is I think there is a kind of now an eco-modernistic drive to change everything to green with an assumption that everything that is existing is not valuable and not green. I think that is where there is that has been the modernist disjunction as well. That modernist planning assumed that everything that exists in the historic city is, like we read in the Athens Charter, is specifically problematic and it needs to change and it needs to be renewed. So I think these disjunctions are something that we need to address in both planning as well as in the discipline of urban conservation.
Thanks very much for that. And I think since you're situated in CEPT, maybe that um, is if there's a way in which you can actually have a foundation course, like you were saying, it's necessary for all planners. And since we don't have anything in planning that actually looks at our own city and builds our own knowledge, rather than, and then you go on to specialize, I think it would help. But yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. I would second Malini's point as well that, it's crucial for all urban planners to be educated in urban histories. And we at Center for Policy Research have just initiated a project known as the Urban Planning Institutions project, which spans several domains of urban dynamics and urban growth and development, and certainly heritage conservation in the way you have framed it, and many others that you, as part of your, body of knowledge production, have framed this, would become critical for urban planning institutions to become more enriched. There are a couple more questions. There's Praveshika Gautam, who says, thank you for an informative session, Dr. Desai. As you spoke of historical districts in the US, I would like to request examples or resources for possible avenues, preservation and constructive augmentation of a contemporary historical, in the very recent sense, migrants neighborhoods, such as Manju Katila, a Tibetan refugee colony in Delhi, or Humayunpur, another neighborhood with unrecognized medieval monuments, which are subject to destruction by private parties, please.
Yeah, I think one of the, I must say before I get into the US examples, the Aga Khan example of Nizamuddin Basti renewal, uh, which addresses similar questions, is a very systematic process. And I think that becomes a very important case study for all of us. But once again, it's a project, and we're still not. So projects can be good projects and bad projects, whereas what we are arguing for is a systemization of this discourse as part of urban transformations, which is what the US does. And I think if you just kind of online try to find the Main Streets project in US, there is the Main Streets project started in uh, 1970s as an idea of identifying migrant neighborhoods as valuable to the people who are migrating, and preserving the histories the way those migrants would like it to be. So the first action that they do is that the first action is to create a citizens collective and collectively built a vision plan of, they call it a Main Streets program because the understanding is that a particular migrant community comes and settles in a neighborhood, and their main street is where their cultural expressions are most visible. So the food that they sell there the architectural symbolism that is seen, that is brought back from home sometimes, or textiles that is seen in furniture or in the furnishings. So the first action that Main Streets Projects does is that it kind of brings the people as a collective with under the guidance of an urban planner or an urban designer or a conservation person, and they start discussing the future and a vision of that place. So in the Main Streets program, you'll find that there will be certain communities that will say that our vision is just to ensure that uh, we continue to remain our heritage or our main street continues to remain valuable to us, continues to have markers that are valuable to us, and whatever development happens has to be cognizant of that. In that case, it's a very simple urban design project. But in certain cases, there have been neighborhoods like Georgetown, for example. They said that we want to transform our neighborhood and we want to welcome tourists. We want to do a complete economic restructuring. We don't want new development. We want to turn around our economy through tourism. And there is this entire Georgetown development project, which they then went on to apply for it to be designated as a historic district. They applied the rules of historic district over there. They've created tourism based urban inserts, but all of it as a part of a citizens development and a citizens transformation program. Now, I think after they have reached a particular stage and they have accepted to an agreed transformation, they have kind of created a facilities management neighborhood group whose job is to just manage the heritage and the cultural economies of the place. So, for example, Georgetown is known for the laces and it is known for the cupcakes because that's what they they are known for, and that's what tourists go over there. So, the last time I visited the place in 2015, they were fighting the sale of one shop to Starbucks, and they did not want Starbucks and McDonald's in their neighborhood. And I don't know what the result was. I've not followed up on that, but I think that I feel was a good way of looking at what the communities want. And as I was giving the example earlier on also, I think if it is a community-led transformation, it is in cognizant or it takes cognizance of the cultural transformation they have the right to. And I think that's important.
There's one question from an anonymous attendee who says, what are your thoughts on rural regeneration? How does rural regeneration be given importance or viewed in India? And how does it play a critical role at a regional scale? The first step would be to see how rural regeneration is related to heritage conservation, I suppose, but over to you, Jigna.
I think rural regeneration is more related to ecological conservation than heritage conservation, because most of whatever my studies of rural areas are related are from Kutch, and what Kutch is this extremely ecological sensitive zone, and whatever I've learned from there tells me that all the historic meanings or cultural meanings that the people derive there are derived from their relationship with the environment. So whether it is their material culture or the non-material culture. So you include their folk songs or the objects they made or how they deal with or what cattles they have and how do they deal with what is the relationship with the cattles or their communities or another communities. They are all related to their environment. And I think it is more of an environmental conservation issue than a heritage conservation issue. I think there are a lot of studies by Madhav Gadgil, and he prepared a tool on people's I'm forgetting what it is called, but people's roster of uh, rural heritage or some I'm forgetting the exact name of it, where that roster essentially is about that people who live in the region have to identify everything that is valuable for them, and which could include a fruit that grows or a little orchard that is kind of a place that they don't go. So one of the places that when I was studying Kutch, there was this area, I was studying a town called Nirona, and there was this little area in Nirona, which is a forest area. Nirona is in the middle of the grasslands, in the middle of the desert, and there's this little forest area. There's a little tomb inside the forest area. And when I was studying as a researcher, you tend to walk in everywhere. And I was walking in there, and a woman came running from behind and just pulled me out and said, "You don't go there, your family will perish." And the belief that that place is uh, not to be touched kind of is also an ecological relationship, that there is in the middle of the desert, there is this green little forest, not more than 3 acres. It is an area that nobody goes, even for gathering small twigs. It's just left as a forest reserve for the community in very difficult circumstances. So I asked her that, do you never go there? And she said that in order to go there, we can go there only if there have been 2 years of drought. And after a particular ritual that we have to do, we are allowed to enter inside. It's an ecological relationship that we need to, I think, recognize and respect. Was there anything?
Yes,
I think,
that shows there's a certain pristine sort of a value also perhaps attached to this thicket, which is in the middle of an arid region. There are a few more questions. We're already very close to 6 p.m. In India. And let me just run through these questions very rapidly, also aloud for the interest of the audience who are still here with us. There's another anonymous attendee, or perhaps the same person, who says, "I saw an image of Vadnagar in one of your slides. Would you say it is a good example of historic cities revival?"
yes and no. And I think it's a very long winding answer, so I don't know if we have time for that. Yes, because Vadnagar is one of the few sites in the country where there is time and resources given for scientific research. And I don't think the level of, I think one can just write an entire uh, book on how heritage should be researched, archaeological heritage, urban heritage, uh, material heritage of all kinds, oral histories. So there was a lot of time and a lot of resources given to do that research. So and what came out of that research was everything is based on scientific observation. So what I was talking about in terms of how should we approach conservation that give time for research, I think Vadnagar has given that time and very genuinely given that time. So from that point of view, yes. And no, because I think it's going to follow the same journey as Hriday. What do you do with that research when you implement it on site is still limited by the urban tools and the governance tools that we have. And I think they lead then to creating, once again, the streets, the facades, the paving, and don't necessarily allow us to engage with the complexity of the place.
Similarly, there's Sandeep Bali who seeks an opinion of yours in terms of how you view a large complex, a complex and large region like Shekhawati.
I'll be very honest with you, I've not given it a thought. I have always been extremely overwhelmed by the scale uh, of the heritage narratives around Shekhawati, and I'll be very honest, I've not given thought to it. But having said that, I think there is a lot of work that has been done on identifying the material culture, the built and the material culture of the place. I think Shekhawati is a very interesting condition where you have to also then layer it with the ecological relationships, which I don't think is happening at the moment. We're kind of separating, just like in cities, we separate planning and conservation. In Shekhawati, we are separating the ecological relationship and the knowledge heritage relationships as two separate things that don't talk to each other. I think we need to kind of do a little bit of course, not a little bit, a big course correction there.
There's a question again going back to rural regions. Neetu Rohila, thank you so much, ma'am. This is very informative. This is very informative session in rural regions. There is a phase of history is going on with old narratives based on the century-old thoughts which are passed on by ancestors. What should be their way of regeneration? Sure.
Regeneration of thoughts is a lost battle, I think. It's lost before it starts. I don't think we can regenerate practices, as I said, thoughts and knowledge. We should not aim to, because we live in the time that we live in, and we need to respect the time that we live in. A critical understanding of those thoughts, a critical understanding of that knowledge, and a selective continuity of it, a scientific selective continuity of it is important. Because as I said, not everything that is told to us or was told to us can. I mean, I always look at myself. Will I practice what my great grandmother practiced? Will I do what my mother told me to do? Will I do what my grandmother told me to do? I will not. I have, and I still call myself practicing a practitioner of Indian culture. So I don't think we should look at it, look at that as a regeneration question, but more as a knowledge question and a critical knowledge question.
Thank you, Jigna. There's the director CPR, Srinivas Tukakula, who's been on the session from the very beginning. He says, excellent talk, Jigna, thank you. You make several references to Kutch. Have you had a chance to look into Bhuj inner city reconstruction post-earthquake? Any reflections on it connecting with earlier questions on urban planners necessarily having to build sensitivity to heritage conservation? It was the 25th anniversary of the earthquake yesterday.
Yeah. I think Bhuj inner city is one of those examples of regeneration, renewal rather, that was done in the aftermath of a disaster where people were so much in shock that they did not have a say in, or could not have a say in what that city is going to look like. And I think at that time, with the rapidness with which the rehabilitation of the city or the renewal of the city was expected, what is, I think it followed the basic footprint. It preserved the major heritage structures, not all, but the major ones. At the time in 2001, whatever the narrative was, I think the urban conservation narrative was also not very developed. Internationally, the urban conservation narrative, the way we are talking about just now, was developed in 2011, was when the first document that spoke about things the way we are talking to. So to that, I would say that it did what it had to. The processes did what they had to do at that point. In retrospect, it could have been done very differently, but hindsight is a luxury in times like these. Now we also have, for historic cities, the rehabilitation processes are also identified in a very different way now. So most of the rehabilitation processes suggest post-disasters do not suggest immediately rebuilding. So for example, when the earthquake happened in 2017 in Italy, in L'Aquila, the city is still not rebuilt. The temporary rehabilitation places were built immediately. People were rehabilitated outside the city. a long conversation on what people value took place over the years, and it is 10 years, almost going to be 10 years next year of L'Aquila. The city is still not rebuilt. They're hoping for it to be rebuilt in the next 5 years. And the conversations that they have had are extremely interesting. They've had conversations with people. For the first 2 years, one must understand people are not going to talk about history. They're going to talk, they're still coming out of the shock of the lives lost, the economies lost, and that rehabilitation, the emotional rehabilitation is important. Once the conversation starts, it's very interesting to see what they have taken back from their older places. So there is this documentation that a group of us in the workshop did, that people took back, of course, old photographs, but there were people who took back stones. And there was one artist who rebuilt the old church, a model of the old church, from the material that he found from the old church. And the entire community then started picking up artifacts or stone elements that were carved from the old church to the rehabilitated area to create a little altar there. So then in certain cases, people picked up their certain totems that were valuable for them, certain photographs that were valuable for them. They started reviving certain songs that their parents taught, which they had forgotten. So it was strange in the way memory and cultural memory became, or collective cultural memory became or induced a process of healing. And it was at that point that the conversations about, so what do we rebuild, started. So I think that is the new doctrine of how cities should be rebuilt after disasters. I don't think that doctrine existed in 2001. I still don't think in India we accept that doctrine.
That's a very thoughtful response, and thank you for that, Jigna. There are two more thoughts here, and we are almost close to our closing line, but I will anyways read these out, and I'd request you to please reflect on them. One question is about how does one differentiate between regeneration, renewal, and revitalization? I think that's more an open question, not just restricted to heritage conservation, but even to in urban and rural development as well. Jinal Savla had a previous response to the question I raised on the politics of nostalgia, and says, such an interesting point. This nostalgia for a certain glorious past of Gujarat during the time of Kings Siddharaja and Solankis is what led to a lot of communal riots over decades in Gujarat. That's a thought that Jinal Savla is sharing. You have any thoughts on the difference on how to differentiate between regeneration, renewal, and revitalization?
Well, I think I would go the Patrick Giddes way here, and I would say that these are biological terms, and that we extrapolate on cities or settlements. And just like and Geddes explains this beautifully when he connects the question of conservative surgery to a human body or a garden for that matter, and suggests that when a part of our body is dilapidated, uh, there are parts of the ailments to our body that can be just regenerated without changing anything about the body, sometimes through exercise, sometimes through medicine, sometimes through a shock to the heart if the heart is stopped. But there are other times when you need to do a bypass. There's a specific renewal required. And then there are some other times when a transplant is needed. And I think he connects this relationship between a city and these biological processes. He was a botanist and a planner, which is a fantastic connection, I feel. And that relationship is something that stays with me every time I look at historic cities and the question of what are we doing with it. Conservation too is an ecological term which we have borrowed in cities. And once again, in ecology, conservation is not about keeping things the way they are. Conservation is about keeping the system conserved, or the processes and the energy of an ecological system conserved for the future, for its future performance. I think we borrowed that term from there, but these terms from there, but I think we've kind of played with them quite loosely. At the moment, we use all these terms interchangeably.
Indeed, and Getty's offers such a strong foundation, especially because you never lose sight of the whole to part relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
About
the politics of nostalgia, I think I think there was somewhere, I'm forgetting where I read this, but there was this idea that I think it was one of the lectures, I'm forgetting where, that this in order to strengthen the legitimacy of any narrative now, especially when it is connecting to a large group of people or large group of society, uh, we it has to be anchored in, or it is received better when it is anchored in a particular past. It is received better when it is anchored in a particular glorious, nostalgic past. And I think that is the politics of it that keeps on getting propped up. And I think historic places, heritage places, sites, they kind of become the what do you say? They become the sites for playing out of such a relationship. So the the question of or the politics of nostalgia is, I find, has very little to do with the history, but about how we want to position um, our thoughts in context of what has happened in the past. So the nostalgia is always more about uh, the action that you want to do for the future rather than what the past means today. It's a narrative, and the politics of it, as we all know, is extremely complex. Uh, I'm not entirely sure if, from whatever history I know, that there is a causal relationship um, between this invoking Siddharaj and Solanki. But yeah, maybe, I don't know. I've not studied it in detail, so I'm not sure of it. But yeah, there was a time in 90s where we said that Ahmedabad should be called Karnavati. Yeah.
That was again another thoughtful response, Jigna. On that note, we should probably close this session. We concluded on some very foundational principles that you felt are important for us to also um, think about and be thoughtful about as we try and shape, the future of our cities from a heritage conservation perspective. And particularly, I think the point you made about nostalgia is actually divorced. Is not rooted in history is such an important point, I think, on that front. And your Gettesian sort of fundamental principles around Gettesian doctrines, if I may say, that one needs to constantly be aware of multiple um, sort of dynamics and forces that come into play in any context, whether uh, it's starting with the natural, the biological factor, to of the other social and political, economic, etc., and other forces that are intrinsic to the idea of a whole, and then make interventions by being cognizant of that whole in the various parts, rather than isolated interventions, as you highlighted, are taking place in the context of Hriday schemes in many cases, for instance, as theme parks. This was very enlightening. Thank you very much for having joined us. Thoroughly enjoyable. Many of our participants and audiences have already shared their appreciation for you. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. I must say, after a long time, I've kind of gone into the basics, and I hope I'm happy that it is valuable to to the discussion that you're all having. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and many thanks to the audience for having stayed all the way till the end of the conversation. Thank you so much again.